In the shadows of America's slave-holding South, countless stories remain buried, tales too grotesque, too shameful, and too disturbing to sit comfortably within the polished pages of official history. One such story is that of a wealthy plantation colonel, a man who had once stood as a symbol of prestige, dominance, and dynastic power, but whose shocking choices ultimately destroyed everything his family had built. At the center of this story lies a scandal so unthinkable for its time that even whispers of it seemed like blasphemy against the codes of Southern society. It was the story of a pact, a chilling agreement, in which a powerful man gave his wife to 7 of his own slaves, setting into motion a series of events that would collapse his dynasty and stain his legacy forever. The 19th century was an era where appearances defined status. Wealthy families in the American South guarded their names as fiercely as they guarded their land. To be a colonel was not only a military rank, but also a social title that carried honor and respect. The colonel in this story belonged to that upper tier, a man whose plantation thrived on the forced labor of enslaved men and women. His world was built upon hierarchy, power, and the belief that he was untouchable. But behind closed doors, his life unraveled in ways that no one could have imagined. The scandal began with the colonel's wife. She was a woman known for her beauty, but also for her silence. Some said she was complicit in her husband's shocking pact, others believed she had no choice but to obey. Whatever the truth, she became the unwilling centerpiece of an arrangement that shook the very foundations of her household. The pact involved 7 enslaved men, each handpicked by the colonel. Their role was not one of labor this time, but of something far more scandalous. In giving his wife to them, the colonel broke every social, moral, and racial code that defined Southern life. Why would a man of such power do such a thing? Historians and storytellers have speculated. Some suggest it was an act of twisted domination, an attempt by the colonel to prove that he alone could bend the world to his will, even at the cost of his family's dignity. Others argue it was born from jealousy, revenge, or even a warped fascination with humiliation. Perhaps it was all of these at once. What is clear is that the decision was not born of love or affection, but of control, ego, and a perverse hunger to test the limits of power. The consequences were swift and merciless. Plantation communities thrived on gossip, and rumors spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about the strange arrangement. The respect the colonel once commanded began to crumble. His wife, stripped of her dignity, became a tragic figure trapped in silence, her true feelings never recorded. The enslaved men, caught in a situation where refusal was not an option, bore the weight of a shame that was not their own. What had once been a household of order now became a house of whispers, shame, and moral collapse. As the scandal deepened, the colonel's once proud dynasty fractured. His children bore the stain of his choices, his fortune faltered under the weight of isolation, and his name became synonymous not with honor but with disgrace. The pact that was meant to prove his dominance instead destroyed him. His empire of land and labor collapsed, leaving behind only fragments of a story so disturbing that many sought to bury it with time. Yet, stories like this resist erasure. They linger in the shadows of history because they expose the grotesque extremes of slavery and patriarchy. This tale is not simply about scandal. It is about power, its abuses, and the devastating costs when one man's obsession with control spirals beyond redemption. It is about a woman forced into silence, enslaved men forced into acts beyond their will, and a family name that crumbled because of one man's pride. Today, the story of the colonel who gave his wife to 7 slaves is more than just a scandalous whisper from the past. It is a mirror to the darkest sides of American slavery. It shows how the cruelty of the system extended beyond labor into the most intimate and devastating corners of human life. And above all, it is a reminder that beneath the polished histories of dynasties and plantations lies a hidden archive of secrets that still demand to be told. The story begins with a man who had everything that the South of the mid-1800s could offer. Colonel James Wetherell, as he was known in records and whispers alike, commanded acres of fertile Georgia land, a house filled with wealth and servants, and a family name that carried respect in every corner of his county. He was tall, commanding, and carried the air of someone who believed his power could never be challenged. To be a colonel was not just to hold land, but to rule a small kingdom where one's word was law. Men like James thrived on power, and that power rested on the backs of enslaved men and women who worked from dawn until dusk to keep the fields alive and the plantation rich. Yet, for all his wealth, James carried within him a darkness, a restless arrogance that would eventually consume him and all that he owned. The colonel's wife, Eleanor, was as much a symbol of his power as his land. She was beautiful, pale, and dressed in silks imported from across the ocean. Guests often remarked on her elegance when they dined at the plantation house, admiring the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. But beneath that surface of refinement, Eleanor lived a life trapped in silence. Her marriage was not one of love but of duty, a bond that tied her to a man whose decisions she could neither challenge nor escape. Behind the grand walls of the Wetherill estate, Eleanor endured the whims of her husband, who treated her less as a partner and more as another possession to bend to his will. The first whispers of scandal began one humid summer evening when the colonel gathered a group of trusted overseers and summoned 7 enslaved men from the fields. They were strong men, each one chosen not by accident but by design. Some were young and powerful, the best laborers in his fields. Others were older, men the colonel had trusted with important tasks. They stood before him with lowered eyes, unsure why they had been called into the great hall where candles flickered and Eleanor sat stiffly in her chair. What followed was not a command they expected. The colonel, with a smirk that carried arrogance and cruelty, declared his intent to make an agreement unlike any other. He would give his wife, his own mistress of the house, to these 7 men. For the enslaved, refusal was not an option. The colonel's word was absolute law. To question him was to risk a whipping, a hanging, or worse. They understood that his demand was not a request but an order, and behind their bowed heads burned a mixture of fear, shame, and anger. Eleanor herself sat frozen, her face drained of color. Whether she had been warned beforehand or not remains uncertain, but in that moment, she became the center of an arrangement that stripped her of any dignity she had left. Why would the colonel do such a thing? To outside eyes, it was madness. To his mind, it was an act of dominance. He wanted to prove that he could break not only the bodies of enslaved men, but also their sense of boundaries. He wanted to prove that he could turn his wife, the symbol of his dynasty, into a pawn in his cruel game. It was humiliation crafted into spectacle, though no outsider was present to witness it. The act was not born of lust but of power twisted into perversion. The days that followed were thick with silence in the household. The enslaved men, forced into roles they had never sought, returned to their labor in the fields with heavy hearts. Among themselves they whispered cautiously, for fear of punishment, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavily upon them. Eleanor carried herself through the plantation like a ghost, her eyes empty, her steps slow. To the world outside, life on the Wetherill plantation continued as usual. Cotton was picked, meals were served, the colonel entertained his peers. But beneath the surface, a fracture had opened that could never be repaired. It did not take long for whispers to escape the walls of the estate. In plantations, secrets were fragile things. Overseers talked after drinking too much. Enslaved people carried fragments of stories to others when they met in the woods. And soon the neighboring planters began to hear rumors of the colonel's strange agreement. At first, many dismissed it as slander. Such a thing was unthinkable, even among men who committed acts of cruelty daily. But as the whispers grew louder, doubt spread. By the time autumn arrived, the Wetherill name was no longer spoken with the same respect. Behind closed doors, people asked the same question. Why had he done it? And what did it mean for the legacy of his family? For the colonel, the whispers were both a thrill and a torment. He walked into public gatherings with his head high, daring others to challenge him. But inside, he knew the whispers were tearing at the very foundation of his dynasty. Respect was a fragile currency among the elite. A man who could not keep order in his own home, who would sacrifice his wife's dignity, who would blur the lines of race and class in such a scandalous way. Such a man could not hold on to his power for long. Eleanor, meanwhile, sank deeper into despair. Her silence was both a shield and a prison. She did not speak of what had happened, not even to her closest friends, and in her silence she became a mystery. Some imagined she had agreed to the arrangement willingly, while others saw her as the greatest victim of all. The truth was locked inside her, and she carried it like a stone in her chest. The enslaved men lived with scars of a different kind. They had no power to refuse, Yet their forced participation left them vulnerable to judgment and shame. They bore the burden of being tied to a scandal that was not of their making. Their names were never written in the records, their voices never preserved, but their lives were changed forever by the Conal's twisted pact. This was the beginning of the end for the Wetherell dynasty. What began as a cruel display of dominance would soon unravel into open disgrace, financial ruin, and a legacy destroyed. The Conal, blinded by arrogance, had thought himself untouchable. But in giving his wife to 7 of his slaves, he had not only broken the codes of his society, he had sealed his family's fate. The scandal that began behind closed doors in the Wetherell Plantation house did not stay hidden for long. In the world of the antebellum South, where appearances were everything, rumors were as dangerous as weapons. By the time autumn rolled through Georgia's cotton fields, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. At first it was overseers speaking in hushed tones after too much whiskey, then neighbors who exchanged knowing glances during Sunday service. Soon the story became an open secret, one that everyone knew but no one dared to speak aloud in the Conal's presence. His world, once built on respect and fear, was beginning to tremble under the weight of scandal. The Conal himself carried on as if nothing had changed. He strutted into county meetings, hosted dinners, and oversaw his fields with the same iron fist. But those who once greeted him with reverence now met him with caution. His peers could not afford to openly condemn him. Many of them had their own sins buried deep in their plantations, but what he had done crossed a line even in their eyes. To give his wife to 7 enslaved men was not just a private matter of the household, it was a violation of the unspoken codes that underpinned their entire society. White supremacy was the foundation of their world, and the Conal had blurred its most sacred boundaries. Eleanor's silence became another source of speculation. In drawing rooms and over garden fences, women whispered about her with both pity and disdain. Some believed she had willingly taken part, that she had surrendered to lust or rebellion. Others saw her as a tragic victim, forced into an arrangement by a husband who saw her not as a woman but as a possession to gamble away. Whatever the truth, Eleanor carried herself with a quiet grace that only deepened the mystery. She never spoke against her husband, never confessed nor denied the rumors, and in that silence she became both untouchable and haunted. The enslaved men who had been dragged into the scandal bore a far more dangerous burden. For them, the Conal's pact was not a story of whispers but a living scar. They had been stripped of any sense of choice, forced into an act that left them vulnerable to punishment, shame, and suspicion among their own. They were both pitied and envied. Pitied because they had been humiliated by being used as pawns in the Conal's game. Envied because others could not help but see their place in the scandal as a strange, twisted kind of power. But in truth, the arrangement had given them no power at all. They were still enslaved, still chained to the fields, still at the mercy of a man who ruled their lives. As the whispers grew louder, the Conal's children became the next victims of his pride. His sons, who once carried his name with pride, now endured taunts and sideways glances. At school, other boys made cruel jokes about their mother. His daughter, who had been considered desirable matches for the county's wealthiest heirs, now faced rejection. No family wanted to tie themselves to a dynasty stained by scandal. In a society where legacy and lineage were currency, the Conal had gambled away the future of his own bloodline. Financial troubles soon followed. Planters who once traded with the Conal now kept their distance. Creditors grew wary, refusing him the easy loans he had once secured on reputation alone. Without support, the plantation began to falter. Crops still grew, but debts mounted. Overseers grumbled, their loyalty shaken by the shame of serving under a disgraced master. Even his own extended family began to turn their backs, unwilling to be dragged into the shadows of his disgrace. The Conal, however, was too proud to admit defeat. He convinced himself that he could weather the storm, that his land and wealth would shield him from complete ruin. But the gossip never stopped. It followed him to church, to markets, to every corner of his life. In the rigid hierarchy of Southern society, he had broken rules that could not be forgiven. His arrogance, once admired as confidence, was now seen as madness. Eleanor, in her quiet suffering, became a ghost within her own home. She rarely left her room except for appearances, and when she did, she carried a distant look that unsettled those who saw her. Some believed she was broken beyond repair. Others thought she carried secrets too dangerous to speak. The truth of her heart, however, was lost to history. Her silence became part of the legend, her figure painted as both complicit and victim depending on who told the story. For the enslaved, life continued with the same brutal rhythm, but now with a new layer of fear. They knew that their lives were bound to the Colonel's whims, and his unpredictable nature made every day uncertain. If he could give his wife away as though she were livestock, what would he do to them next? Their survival depended on silence, obedience, and the hope that the scandal would eventually fade. But in the deep corners of the quarters, away from the ears of overseers, the story of the pact was retold in whispers, passed down as a tale of the master's madness. By the winter of that year, the Wetherell name was broken beyond repair. Invitations stopped arriving, allies disappeared, and creditors pressed harder. The Colonel's house, once filled with laughter, music, and guests, now echoed with emptiness. What remained was a family fractured, enslaved people living under a cloud of tension, and a master whose pride had led them all into ruin. This was not yet the final collapse of the dynasty, but the cracks had spread too far to be mended. What began as one man's arrogant pact had grown into a scandal that poisoned every corner of his life. His land, his fortune, his family, his name, all were tainted. And though the Colonel walked with his head high, as if daring the world to challenge him, inside he must have known that he had already destroyed himself. The dynasty that had taken generations to build was now crumbling, undone not by war or disaster, but by the reckless arrogance of its own master. By the time another year had passed on the Wetherell plantation, the weight of the scandal had become unbearable. What had begun as whispers now felt like a permanent brand etched into the Colonel's name. In a world where honor was everything, his was gone. The Colonel, once known for his stern discipline and commanding presence, had become the subject of mockery in nearby towns. Men who once shook his hand with respect now smirked behind his back, and women who once nodded politely in church now turned their eyes away. He carried himself with defiance, but every corner of his life bore the mark of his reckless pride. Inside the plantation house, the atmosphere grew heavy with despair. Eleanor, his wife, had retreated almost entirely from public life. She walked the halls of her home like a shadow, rarely speaking, rarely smiling, and often spending long hours in her chamber staring out the window across the cotton fields. Some said she was broken by what she had been forced into. Others believed she carried a secret hatred for her husband, but whatever lived in her heart remained locked away. Even her children began to distance themselves from her, for they too were trapped in the shame of their father's decision. To be the Colonel's child was to carry a burden no one could shake. The children suffered most outside the plantation. His sons, once seen as heirs to a proud dynasty, were mocked openly. They were no longer invited to gatherings, and their ambitions of securing influential marriages or political futures had dissolved. His daughters faced an even crueler fate. In a society where a young woman's worth was tied to her marriage prospects, no family of standing wanted to tie themselves to the Wetherell name. Suitors who once pursued them with gifts and polite conversation now vanished, leaving the girls isolated and bitter. The dynasty's future was crumbling not only in reputation but in bloodline, as no new connections could be forged to sustain it. Meanwhile, the enslaved population of the plantation bore the strange, dangerous aftermath of the pact. Those 7 men, forced into the Colonel's twisted game, carried scars deeper than the lash could leave. They knew they had been pawns in a humiliation that would never be spoken of openly, but one that could never truly be erased. Their lives were unchanged in labor. They still rose before dawn, still bent their backs in the fields, still answered to overseers. But in the silence of the quarters, their story became part of the oral history of survival. Some whispered about whether Eleanor had ever spoken to them afterward, whether her silence was one of shame or of pity. But the truth remained a wound left unhealed, unacknowledged by the master who had inflicted it. The Colonel's arrogance continued to guide his every move. Rather than stepping back, he attempted to overcompensate for his loss of respect. He bought fine clothes, imported rare wines, and threw extravagant dinners that no one wanted to attend. Guests who did arrive did so reluctantly, staying only long enough to maintain the most superficial ties. His attempts to display wealth only highlighted the emptiness of his halls, where laughter and admiration had once thrived. Financial troubles grew worse. Creditors who once trusted his name now demanded payments in full. Trade partners chose to deal with other planters, citing the Colonel's growing instability. Rumors of his reckless spending and strange behavior fueled doubts about his ability to manage his estate. Overseers began to leave, unwilling to tie their reputations to his downfall. For the first time, the Colonel faced the prospect of losing not only his honor, but the land that defined him. The final blow to his fragile image came when a neighboring planter confronted him during a gathering. The man, emboldened by drink and the safety of company, mocked the Colonel openly, asking if his seven field hands were still keeping the mistress warm at night. Laughter filled the room, and for the first time, the Colonel found himself powerless. He struck the man, but the damage was already done. The insult spread quickly across the county, repeated in every tavern and parlor. Whatever respect lingered was gone. He was no longer feared, no longer admired, he was ridiculed. Back at the plantation, the tension between master and enslaved grew sharper. The Colonel's temper worsened, his punishments more brutal, his rages unpredictable. Some believed he lashed out because he saw in the enslaved faces a reflection of his humiliation. The 7 men in particular became targets of his cruelty, though he could never speak of why. His fury became their punishment, and in his rage, he only deepened the wounds he had created. Eleanor, isolated and broken, began to withdraw further into herself. There were whispers that she had fallen ill, though whether her sickness was of the body or of the spirit, no one could say. Servants claimed she spent nights weeping, her sobs muffled by the heavy walls of the mansion. To the outside world, she remained silent, but within, she was unraveling. Her tragedy was not only her own humiliation, but the loss of her children's future. The destruction of everything she had once been promised when she married into the Wetherill name. The dynasty that had once seemed unshakable was now in ruins. The plantation still stood, the fields still bore crops, but the family that presided over it was broken. Neighbors who once envied the Wetherills now pointed to them as a warning of what pride and arrogance could destroy. Children who once bore the name with pride now carried it with shame. Enslaved men and women who had once lived under the shadow of a powerful master now watched as his world crumbled. Proof that even the most powerful could not escape ruin when corruption and cruelty guided their choices. By the end of that year, the Colonel was a man surrounded by walls but abandoned by respect. His wealth had dwindled, his alliances shattered, his family isolated. All that remained was his pride, a hollow shell of the man he had once been. He had set in motion a scandal that could never be undone, and though he still walked with his head high, those who saw him knew he was broken. The dynasty was already dead. The only question that remained was how long it would take before the last stone of the Wetherill Empire fell into dust. Winter settled heavy over Georgia, and with it came the slow suffocation of the Wetherill dynasty. The fields still stretched wide, but the harvests brought little comfort. The Colonel's debts were mounting, and the whispers of scandal had hardened into open contempt. There was no more respect left for him in the county. He was tolerated, perhaps feared in his rages, but he was no longer honored. Every banquet table he approached grew silent. Every church pew seemed to tighten when he arrived. His name, once a badge of power, now carried the weight of disgrace. The Colonel attempted to cling to the image of control, but his empire had begun to slip away. Overseers who once carried out his commands without question now walked with unease. Some quit, leaving the plantation short of men to enforce discipline. Those who stayed found the Colonel unpredictable, lashing out over small failures, venting his anger at every reminder of his humiliation. He flogged enslaved men for imagined slights, punished women for failing to bow low enough, and shouted orders that made little sense. The once proud master now seemed consumed by madness, fighting battles not only with his neighbors but with his own shadow. Eleanor, his wife, had faded almost entirely from view. The woman who once presided over the great house's parlor with grace now spent her days locked away, pale and frail, her health declining. Servants whispered that she had wasted away from grief, that her heart had been broken beyond repair. To the outside world she was a ghost, and her silence became the final seal on the scandal. By never defending herself, never speaking against her husband, she allowed the rumors to harden into legend. And though she lived, she was already mourned by many who saw in her hollow eyes the ruin of a woman who had been used, discarded, and silenced. The Colonel's children bore the weight of their father's choices more heavily with each passing season. His sons were refused in business, mocked in taverns, and cast aside by families who once considered them fine matches. His daughters, once admired for their beauty, now sat unmarried and unwanted. No suitor wanted to tie himself to the bloodline of a man whose pride had led to such disgrace. For them, the scandal was not only their father's shame but the end of their own futures. The dynasty could not extend into new generations. It had been cut off, strangled by its own reputation. In the quarters of the enslaved, the story of the pact lived on in hushed tones. The 7 men who had been forced into it bore not only their master's cruelty, but also the burden of being tied to the mistress of the house in a way that made them targets of his rage. They endured extra labor, harsher punishments, and suspicious eyes. Yet among their people, their story became a symbol of the master's madness, a tale of how pride could twist power into something self-destructive. For the enslaved community, who lived each day under the crushing weight of bondage, the slow fall of the Colonel's house was a rare glimpse of justice, even if it was poisoned by suffering. The wider world, too, began to take note. Travelers passing through Charleston or Savannah heard the scandal repeated as a cautionary tale. Planters told the story behind closed doors, each man adding his own embellishments, until the Colonel was not only disgraced but made into a figure of grotesque legend. Some said he had lost his mind, others that he had sold his soul in exchange for power and was now paying the price. Whatever the details, the story spread, and the name Wetherell was no longer synonymous with wealth but with shame. The Colonel himself grew more erratic with each passing month. Pride kept him from retreating, but inside he was unraveling. He drank heavily, his temper worsened, and his once calculated cruelty became reckless violence. His nights were spent pacing through the halls of his crumbling mansion, shouting at shadows, reliving the insults and laughter of his enemies. In the fields, he barked orders until his voice cracked, trying to prove that he was still master of something, even as his grip slipped away. The collapse came in stages, each more devastating than the last. First, the creditors arrived, demanding payment that the Colonel could no longer provide. Lands were sold off piece by piece, stripping the plantation of the vastness that had once been its pride. Then came the betrayal of family. Cousins and distant kin who once leaned on the Colonel's power now refused to answer his letters, refusing to tie their fates to his downfall. Even the church turned cold, its elders urging him quietly to step back from public life, a polite way of banishing him from the community. But perhaps the cruelest collapse was within the Colonel's own household. His children, who had once looked to him with awe and fear, now saw him as the architect of their ruin. Resentment simmered in every corner of the home, whispered in corridors, revealed in the way his sons avoided him, the way his daughters turned away when he spoke. The dynasty that had been built on his name was now suffocating beneath it. By the spring that followed, the Wetherell Plantation stood not as a symbol of power but as a warning. The house was quiet, its halls echoing with absence. Its fields underworked, its master pacing restlessly like a ghost haunting his own legacy. The once mighty Colonel had destroyed himself, not with war or famine or rebellion, but with a single decision born of arrogance. In giving his wife to 7 slaves, he had sought to prove his dominance. Instead, he had unraveled the very threads of his own dynasty. The story of the Colonel's fall became more than gossip. It was a tale told in whispers to warn others of what unchecked pride could do. Neighbors spoke of it with a mixture of horror and satisfaction, a reminder that even the most powerful could fall and fall hard. For the enslaved, it was a sign that justice, however twisted, sometimes found its way into the cracks of power. For Eleanor and her children, it was tragedy written in silence and shame. And for the Colonel, it was the end of everything he had ever sought to build. The dynasty was finished. Its lands divided, its name disgraced, its heirs scattered and unwanted. What had taken generations of labor, cruelty, and ambition to build was undone in less than a decade. All because one man, blinded by pride, believed himself untouchable. His downfall was not only personal but generational, a reminder that power built on cruelty always carries within it the seed of its own destruction. The final years of the Colonel's life were a slow, agonizing descent into ruin. The man who had once ridden through the county with his back straight and his chin high now wandered his decaying plantation like a ghost haunting its own halls. His clothes hung loose upon him, stained by liquor and sweat. His once commanding voice had turned into a rasp, slurred more often than not. The colonel was no longer feared, not even by those he beat, for he had lost the sharp edge of control. He was a broken man, consumed by his own choices. The house itself mirrored his fall. Paint peeled from the walls, windows cracked and were left unrepaired, and the roof leaked when it rained. Servants who once bustled through its grand corridors were gone, sold off or run away, leaving the estate quiet and hollow. The great dining hall, where once glittering feasts had been held, was now dark and empty, its long table covered in dust. The mirrors reflected nothing but decay, their gilt frames dulled by neglect. Guests no longer came to visit. Even his kin stayed away. The Wetherell home had become a place no one wished to enter. A tomb for the living. Eleanor had retreated into silence. Her health had deteriorated so much that she rarely left her chamber. She ate little, spoke less, and stared often into the middle distance, as if waiting for something that would never come. To those who still caught glimpses of her, she seemed less a woman than a shadow of one, with hollow cheeks and a distant gaze. Some said her spirit had been crushed by her husband's cruelty. Others whispered that she had gone mad with shame. Whatever the truth, she no longer fought, no longer resisted. She simply endured, a prisoner within her own home. The children scattered. The colonel's sons sought work in distant towns, hoping to shed the curse of their father's name. His daughters remained unmarried, living under the weight of scandal. Some found themselves treated with pity, others with ridicule. The dynasty the colonel had once sworn to expand through wealth and power now stood barren. His bloodline carried forward only through whispers of shame, not through the prosperity he had once envisioned. The enslaved community observed his decline with quiet satisfaction, though they still lived in bondage. There was a sense of grim justice in watching the master destroy himself. The 7 men who had once been forced into the infamous pact carried their scars, but they also carried a certain pride in knowing that their very existence had helped unravel his empire. Around campfires, stories spread of how the colonel's arrogance had turned back upon him, how he had become the author of his own ruin. For those who had endured his cruelty, it was proof that no master, however powerful, could escape the judgment of his own actions. By the early 1850s, creditors had stripped away much of what remained. The colonel was forced to sell parcels of land until the plantation was reduced to a fraction of its former size. He fought the sales bitterly, raging against the banks and lawyers who came to claim what was owed. Yet he was powerless. His debts outweighed his influence. Each sale was a knife to his pride, a reminder that the wealth he had squandered could never be regained. The wider community no longer treated him as an equal. At church gatherings, he sat alone. At county meetings, his words were ignored. Once he had commanded attention, now he was a figure of ridicule. The story of his scandal retold with laughter at his expense. His enemies, those he had once humiliated with arrogance, now found pleasure in his downfall. But perhaps the worst wound came from former allies who now turned their backs, pretending they had never stood beside him. His name was spoken only as a warning, a tale told to sons about the dangers of unchecked pride and folly. As his world collapsed, the colonel turned inward. He roamed the empty halls of his house at night, muttering to himself, sometimes shouting as though unseen enemies mocked him from the shadows. The servants who remained whispered of hearing his boots clatter down the corridors in the darkness, of the sound of breaking glass, of drunken cries that echoed long into the night. They said he often called out Eleanor's name, not in tenderness but in anger, as though blaming her for his ruin. Some even claimed to have heard him cursing the 7 enslaved men, spitting their names into the dark as if they had conspired against him. Yet in quieter moments, there were signs that the colonel knew the truth. He would sit alone on the porch, staring out over the fields, his hands trembling around a glass of whiskey. His eyes, once sharp with calculation, seemed hollow. More than once, he muttered that he had been tricked by his own pride, that he had lost everything by trying to prove he could not be touched. These fragments of confession were never spoken openly, never written down, but they slipped out in his solitude. Perhaps he finally understood what he had done. Perhaps the weight of it all became too heavy to deny. Eleanor's death came quietly, sometime in the spring of 1854. She passed in her bed, frail and thin, her final breath barely stirring the air. The colonel did not weep. He stood beside her lifeless body, his face expressionless, then turned away. But those who saw him afterward noticed a change. Whatever thread had kept him tethered to the world seemed to snap with her passing. He drank more heavily, raged less, and sank deeper into despair. His madness dulled into a hollow silence. He no longer fought, no longer threatened, no longer barked orders. He simply drifted through his days, waiting for the end. It came not with grandeur, but with quiet inevitability. In the summer of 1856, the colonel was found dead in his study, slumped over the very desk where he had once signed contracts and written letters that shaped his empire. The bottle beside him was half empty, his glass still in hand. His death was not mourned beyond the walls of his crumbling estate. No great funeral was held, no crowds gathered to honor him. He was buried on the family grounds, his grave marked by a simple stone, already sinking into the earth. The Wetherell dynasty ended there. The lands were auctioned off, the great house fell further into disrepair, and the name faded from the rolls of power. What remained was not legacy but legend, a story of scandal, pride, and ruin. The colonel had set out to prove his dominance, to leave behind a dynasty of strength and wealth. Instead, he left a cautionary tale, whispered across the South for years to come. In the end, his agreement with 7 enslaved men had not only destroyed his wife and his family but himself. It was proof that even in an age where men like him held unchecked power, that power could still collapse under the weight of its own corruption. His empire had been built on cruelty, and cruelty had been the very force that tore it apart. The colonel's story became one of those tales passed quietly from one generation to the next, half history, half warning. For some, it was a reminder of the dangers of arrogance. For others, especially the descendants of the enslaved, it was a bitter satisfaction. The knowledge that the master who had once claimed to own lives had lost his own to the choices he made. And for history itself, it became another shadow in the long, dark record of America's past, a secret too shameful to be spoken loudly, yet too powerful to ever be forgotten. After the colonel's death, the plantation lingered like a corpse left unburied, its decay stretching into every corner of the land. The great house that had once been the pride of the Wetherell family now stood as a hollow shell, windows broken, porches sagging, and weeds creeping up the brick walls. It no longer welcomed guests or echoed with laughter. Instead, it moaned with the groans of settling wood and the cries of owls nesting in the rafters. The dynasty that had once been so feared, so envied, was gone, leaving behind nothing but whispers and ruin. The colonel's children, scattered and broken by the scandal, bore no strength to rebuild. His sons, burdened with the Wetherell name, found doors closed wherever they went. Employers refused them, merchants mistrusted them, and prospective wives' families turned away with disgust. The stigma was too heavy, too ingrained. They were sons of disgrace, and no amount of hard work could scrub away their father's sins. Some wandered westward, hoping the frontier might give them anonymity, while others sank into obscurity, reduced to laborers in towns where no one cared about their family name. His daughters fared no better. Once admired for their beauty, they now lived in the long shadow of scandal. Suitors who might have once courted them kept their distance, unwilling to marry into a bloodline cursed by shame. A few became dependents of distant relatives, living quietly as burdens, their lives reduced to a half-existence. The promise of marriage, wealth, and status, everything their upbringing had guaranteed, evaporated like mist. They became forgotten women, their names barely remembered even in family records. The Wetherell daughters were buried long before their bodies met the earth, their futures killed by their father's sins. The enslaved, too, felt the shift. With the colonel gone and the family fractured, control over the plantation dissolved. Overseers abandoned their posts when wages went unpaid, leaving fields untended and houses crumbling. For the first time in memory, the enslaved people of the Wetherell estate found themselves living without the strict iron hand that had once defined their every moment. Some seized the chance to slip away under the cover of night, fleeing into forests or seeking refuge with relatives on neighboring plantations. Others stayed, not out of loyalty, but because the broken estate offered more freedom than they had ever known. The rules had collapsed, and with them, the suffocating discipline of slavery loosened, if only slightly. But the ruin of the dynasty was not merely local gossip, it became legend. Across Georgia and beyond, the story of the colonel's pact spread, reshaped and exaggerated with every telling. In taverns, the tale was told with sneers, men laughing at how one of their own had destroyed himself by arrogance. In church circles, it was whispered as a warning about moral corruption, proof of how sin invited divine punishment. Among the enslaved, the tale carried another weight altogether. It was told as a story of justice, how a master's cruelty had come back to devour him. The details shifted depending on the speaker, but the heart of the tale remained the same. The Conal's pride had undone him, and his family had paid the price. As years passed, the land itself was divided and sold. Creditors took their share. Speculators carved it into parcels, and soon the once great plantation was nothing more than scattered farms worked by men who had no memory of the Wetherell name. The great house fell further into ruin, its roof collapsing, its grand staircase rotting until it was unsafe to climb. Travelers who passed the property pointed at it as a curiosity, a haunted place where owls roosted in the rafters and weeds covered the gardens that had once been trimmed to perfection. Children dared one another to step into the empty halls, swearing they heard the echo of the Conal's boots or the whispers of Eleanor's voice. By the time the Civil War came, the name Wetherell was nearly erased. Some descendants had melted into anonymity, changing their names to escape the burden of their past. Others had died young, their lives eroded by poverty and shame. The once mighty dynasty had no soldiers leading charges, no politicians speaking in the halls of power. It had become dust. The Conal's pact with his wife and 7 enslaved men had not only destroyed his present, but had poisoned his bloodline for generations. For historians, scraps of the story survived in ledgers, court records, and the gossip of neighboring families. But the full truth was buried, left to linger in rumor. Many chose not to write it down at all, preferring to let the scandal rot in silence. Southern elites, who guarded their image with ferocity, wanted no reminder that one of their own had collapsed in such grotesque disgrace. The absence of written accounts was deliberate, an effort to bury shame. Yet the story endured in oral tradition, carried by those who had witnessed it, whispered to grandchildren, retold by descendants of the enslaved. And so the legend of the Conal lingered like a ghost. Some said his spirit walked the ruins, restless and furious, searching for the dynasty he had lost. Others claimed Eleanor's shadow could be seen staring from the windows of the great house, her hollow eyes locked on the fields that had once been her prison. To those who believed, the land itself was cursed, soaked with the arrogance and cruelty of its former master. Even decades later, farmers who bought pieces of the plantation swore of bad luck, crops failing, animals dying, storms battering the land more than anywhere else. The Conal's curse, they said, had not lifted. The lesson of his downfall remained clear, though each group told it differently. For his peers, it was a parable of pride, a warning that even the richest planter could fall if he lost control of his household. For the enslaved, it was a tale of hidden victory, proof that no chain of power was unbreakable. For his own bloodline, it was a scar that could not be healed, a stain that haunted them no matter how far they fled. In the end, the dynasty did not die in a single dramatic blow. It withered slowly, eaten away by shame, until nothing remained. The Conal had thought himself a master of men, untouchable in wealth and power. Yet he had become a cautionary tale, his family erased, his estate turned to dust, his name surviving only in whispers. His pact had been meant to prove his dominance, but it had exposed his weakness, and that weakness had consumed him, his wife, his children, and every dream of legacy he had ever built. The ruins of the Wetherell estate stand even now as a testament to that downfall. Stones sinking into the soil, trees twisting through broken walls, and silence echoing in empty halls. A dynasty destroyed not by war nor famine nor rebellion, but by its own master's choices. In the end, his agreement did not only destroy a dynasty, it carved a scar into history, one too deep to ever truly fade. Long after the Conal was buried beneath the family grounds, the scandal that bore his name did not rest with him. If anything, his death gave the tale new life, for now the story could spread without fear of retaliation. Gossip no longer whispered in the dark corners of parlors. It moved freely, drifting from county to county, spilling beyond Georgia's borders. By the late 1850s, the Wetherell scandal had become a Southern legend, a cautionary tale that revealed the rot beneath the polished manners of the planter elite. In Charleston, merchants repeated it with mocking laughter, describing how a proud master had bartered away his dignity. In Savannah, Ministers warned their congregations that the story was proof of what happened when God's laws were broken by vanity and sin. Across South Carolina, Alabama, and even into Virginia, the story grew legs, reshaped with every telling. Some swore the Conal had been cursed by a witch from Africa, that the pact with 7 enslaved men had been sealed not with ink, but with blood. Others claimed Eleanor herself had sought revenge for years of cruelty, that she had conspired with the slaves to destroy her husband's legacy. Each retelling warped the truth further, but the essence remained. The Conal had destroyed his dynasty with his own hand. Among planters, the scandal was treated both as entertainment and as a mirror. Some laughed at the Wetherell name, glad to see one of their rivals ruined. But beneath the surface was unease, for the tale struck too close to home. Many of them harbored secrets of their own, hidden children, coerced unions, and acts they prayed would never see the light of day. The Conal's story reminded them that even the richest could not always bury their sins. The downfall of one man was a warning to all. Arrogance and cruelty carried a price that could not be escaped. The enslaved carried the story in another direction altogether. Passed from plantation to plantation, it became a tale of poetic justice. Around fires at night, they spoke of how the Conal had tried to play God, only to be undone by his own design. For them, it was not only about one man's ruin, but about the cracks in the system of slavery itself. If the great Conal could fall, then perhaps others could too. It was a whisper of hope, a reminder that even those who seemed untouchable were vulnerable to destruction. In their version of the tale, the 7 enslaved men stood not as victims but as symbols of resistance, men whose role in the scandal had toppled a dynasty. By the time the Civil War loomed, the Wetherell name was synonymous with shame. Confederate officers who traced family lines to prove honor made sure to bury any connection to the disgraced dynasty. Soldiers mocked one another by comparing failures to pulling a Wetherell. In taverns, men drank to the story as though it were a folk song, laughing at the image of a proud Conal undone by his own bargain. The scandal had become folklore, woven into the fabric of Southern storytelling. Even in the North, newspapers picked up fragments of the tale, often exaggerated for dramatic effect. Abolitionist writers seized on it as evidence of the moral corruption of slavery, pointing to the Conal's pact as proof that the system degraded not only the enslaved, but also the masters themselves. Pamphlets circulated describing the Conal's fall, framed as a parable of Southern depravity. While the details were often inaccurate, the use of the story in political debate ensured that the Wetherell name would not be forgotten. As the war ravaged the South, the ruins of the Conal's estate became a symbol of more than personal disgrace. Soldiers passing through spoke of it as a haunted place, cursed by the sins of its master. Union troops who later occupied the area used the abandoned house as a barracks, leaving graffiti on the walls, mocking the legacy of a man who had once thought himself invincible. They told stories of hearing strange sounds in the halls, footsteps echoing on empty stairs, the faint cries of a woman in the night. The legend of Eleanor's ghost staring from the broken windows took firm root, and by the war's end, the Wetherell estate was as much a ghost story as a scandal. Generations later, the story lived on, reshaped into folklore. Children in Georgia grew up daring one another to visit the ruins, swearing they could still hear the Conal's boots stomping through the halls. Travelers wrote of the haunted plantation, where greed and pride had summoned a curse. Locals treated the story as both entertainment and warning. That power built on cruelty could not stand forever. What made the scandal endure was not only its shock but its symbolism. The Conal had been the embodiment of Southern aristocracy, wealthy, powerful, arrogant, convinced of his own superiority. His downfall reflected the fragility of that system. It showed that even the strongest dynasties could collapse, not through rebellion or war, but through their own corruption. The Conal's decision had not been forced upon him, it had been his choice, born of pride and obsession. In the end, his downfall was not the work of others but of himself. That truth struck deeper than gossip, because it suggested that every dynasty carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. For descendants of the enslaved, the story survived not as scandal but as justice. Families told the tale of the 7 men who had been at the center of it all, transforming them into figures of quiet heroism, though forced into a pact by their master. In the retelling, they became symbols of how enslaved men could bring down the very system meant to crush them. Their names were lost, but their role in the legend endured, giving hope to generations who carried the memory of bondage. The Wetherell name, once spoken with reverence, disappeared from polite society. It lived only in whispers, in jokes, in ghost stories told under the cover of night. It was a dynasty that had not only fallen but had been erased, remembered only through the scandal that destroyed it. That was the Conal's true legacy, not the lands he owned, nor the wealth he once displayed, but the tale of his pride and his ruin. And so the story spread, reshaped by time, carried from mouth to mouth, across plantations, across states, across generations. It was no longer simply the downfall of one man. It was a parable of power, pride, and destruction. A Southern tragedy that became a ghost story, a moral warning, and a whispered victory all at once. The Conal was gone, but the tale of his pact lived on, haunting America long after the dynasty he built had turned to dust. After the Civil War, the South was a broken landscape of ashes and sorrow. Plantations that once stood as emblems of wealth now lay in ruin, their fields empty, their mansions scarred by cannon fire or abandonment. Among these ghostly remains, the Wetherell estate carried a reputation darker than most. Where other ruins spoke of loss, the Wetherell land spoke of a curse. To locals, it was not just another fallen plantation, but a place where sin had taken root so deeply that it poisoned the soil itself. The house stood silent, its once grand columns cracked and crumbling, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Windows were shattered, their jagged edges catching moonlight like the teeth of a beast. Ivy crept across the walls, swallowing brick and mortar as if nature itself wished to erase all memory of what had been. No one dared live there after the Conal's death. Tenants refused to work the land, claiming that tools went missing. Animals refused to graze, and strange noises echoed in the halls at night. Whispers of haunting began soon after Union soldiers abandoned the property. They had used the plantation house as a temporary barracks, but even hardened men of war spoke of eerie happenings. Doors slamming in the dead of night, cold drafts sweeping through rooms despite sealed windows, and the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Some soldiers reported waking to the sound of a woman crying softly near their bunks, though no one could ever find the source. Others swore they saw a figure in white standing at the window of the master bedroom, staring into the dark fields. The locals insisted it was Eleanor, the Conal's wife, cursed to wander the home forever. In their version of the story, she could not escape because she had been both victim and participant in the scandal that destroyed her family. Some said she wept in regret, while others believed her spirit was vengeful, protecting the secrets that had died with her. The most chilling accounts claimed she could be heard whispering the names of the 7 enslaved men, her voice echoing through the halls like a prayer or a curse. The story of the 7 men became part of the haunting as well. Field hands in the area swore that on certain nights, shadows resembling men could be seen moving across the overgrown fields, their figures bending and swaying as though still working the land. Travelers passing by late at night claimed to hear the clank of chains dragging across the dirt road, though no one was there. The tale spread quickly. The spirits of the enslaved had not left the Wetherell estate, bound forever to the place where their lives had been twisted into the Conal's ruin. By the 1870s, the Wetherell plantation was considered cursed ground. Superstitious farmers refused to buy it, no matter how low the price fell. Children were warned not to stray too close, for the house was said to swallow those who entered and never let them out. Some told tales of boys who had dared each other to step inside only to emerge days later, their hair white as snow and their eyes haunted. Whether true or not, the legend kept most at a safe distance. At night, lanterns were said to flicker in the windows though the house was abandoned. Neighbors claimed to hear distant voices, a mixture of weeping, laughter, and angry shouts. Horses spooked when led near the estate, pulling violently against their reins as if sensing danger. Dogs refused to cross the boundary of the old gates, howling at the house from a distance, but never daring to enter. Yet the haunted reputation only strengthened the story's hold on the community. For freedmen and their descendants, the ruin became a symbol of justice. To them, it was proof that God had judged the Conal and his bloodline, leaving their estate as a decayed monument to sin. They told their children that the land was cursed because it had been watered with cruelty and arrogance, and that the ruins stood as a reminder that no master, no matter how powerful, could escape the weight of his crimes. folklore continued to grow with each retelling. By the 1880s, some locals believed that treasure was buried within the plantation walls, hidden by the colonel before his death. Treasure hunters occasionally braved the house, digging through basements and tearing apart walls in search of gold. None found wealth, but many left claiming they had seen or heard the supernatural. A few never returned at all, further fueling the legend that the land itself devoured intruders. Ghost stories tied to the Wetherell estate soon reached beyond Georgia. Travelers recorded their impressions in journals, describing eerie feelings of dread that fell upon them when passing near the property. Newspapers picked up fragments of the tale, often embellishing the scandal with new horrors. Some claimed Eleanor's ghost lured men into the house. Others swore the colonel's figure could be seen on stormy nights, pacing the balcony as though still guarding his ruined kingdom. The haunted plantation became part of Southern folklore, blending scandal with the supernatural. Ministers used it as a sermon warning against pride and sin. Storytellers wove it into fireside tales, delighting in the shivers it caused. Parents used it to frighten unruly children into obedience misbehave, and the colonel's ghost will come for you. For decades, the ruin was not simply a decayed house, but a stage on which morality tales and ghost stories played endlessly. Yet beneath the superstition lay a darker truth. The haunting was not just the work of imagination, but of memory. The land bore the weight of human suffering, of blood spilled and dignity stripped. To those who had lived through it, the cries at night were not ghosts but echoes of real pain, reverberations that history refused to silence. The ruin itself was a monument not to wealth or grandeur, but to cruelty and its consequences. By the turn of the century, the Wetherell name had all but vanished from public records, swallowed by shame. The estate stood as the only reminder. Its silhouette against the moon, a chilling image of pride turned to dust. Travelers came not to see its beauty, but to glimpse its terror, to stand at the gates and feel the weight of its story. It was no longer a plantation, it was a graveyard of sins. And so, long after the colonel and Eleanor and the 7 enslaved men had passed into history, the land remained alive with whispers. Each gust of wind carried the sound of footsteps. Each creak of wood seemed like a voice calling from another world. The ruin refused to die, just as the story refused to fade. The Wetherell estate had become eternal, bound not by stone or soil, but by legend. The cursed dynasty that destroyed itself and haunted America ever since. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Old South had long been buried under the progress of a new America. Railroads cut across landscapes once marked by cotton fields, and cities swelled with factories and workers. Yet even as the region changed, whispers of the past refused to disappear. Among these whispers, the story of the colonel and his scandalous pact with his wife and 7 enslaved men continued to live on, not as a fact in history books, but as a legend that haunted both memory and imagination. Historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to collect tales from the Civil War era, often through oral histories, letters, and journals. The Wetherell estate, by then a crumbling ruin shrouded in ivy, drew special attention. Locals spoke of the curse that hung over the land, and writers, hungry for sensational stories, turned it into fodder for books and periodicals. The line between history and folklore blurred until no one could be certain where truth ended and myth began. Some early historians treated the story as scandalous gossip, evidence of the moral decay that had supposedly justified the collapse of the slave-holding South. They painted the colonel as a symbol of arrogance, a man whose pride and cruelty had led him to madness. In their accounts, the pact with the enslaved men was not just an act of sin, but an allegory for the collapse of an entire system. For them, the scandal explained why dynasties built on slavery could never last. Their very foundations were corrupt. Other writers took a different approach. They romanticized the tale, transforming it into a Gothic drama meant to thrill rather than teach. In these retellings, Eleanor became the tragic heroine, a woman forced into silence, her beauty wasted, her spirit doomed to haunt the halls of her ruined home. The colonel, meanwhile, became a figure of villainy, sometimes portrayed as a madman, sometimes as a cold schemer. The enslaved men were often reduced to shadowy figures, robbed of their humanity once again, used only as symbols of fate and vengeance. In the hands of sensationalist writers, the Wetherell scandal became entertainment, stripped of its deeper truths about slavery and power. But not all storytellers dismissed the humanity of the enslaved. In the 1920s and 1930s, As African American scholars and folklorists began to reclaim narratives of slavery, the tale of the Wetherell Plantation resurfaced in a new light. They asked different questions. What did it mean for the enslaved men who had been forced into this pact? How had their lives been scarred by a decision they had no power to refuse? What legacies of trauma did such stories leave behind in the memory of Black communities? For these writers, the haunting of the Wetherell estate was not just supernatural. It was historical, the ghost of slavery itself. The Works Progress Administration's Federal Writers Project in the 1930s collected thousands of oral histories from formerly enslaved people. Though the Wetherell story is not found in direct testimony, accounts from nearby counties described similar abuses, where enslaved women and men were forced into sexual arrangements against their will by masters seeking both control and gratification. The Wetherell scandal, then, fit into a larger pattern of truth, even if its details remained clouded in rumor. The line between fact and folklore mattered less than the reality it represented. The depths of cruelty possible in a system where human beings were treated as property. By mid-century, the story had become something of a Southern legend, passed down through generations not only as a warning but as a mirror of shame. Tourists in the 1950s visiting the ruins of plantations in Georgia sometimes heard guides whisper about the Conal's unholy pact. Ghost tours in Charleston and Savannah adopted variations of the tale, weaving it into their nighttime scripts. For many outsiders, it became a ghost story, something to thrill and terrify. But for those whose ancestors had lived through slavery, it remained something far more serious. A reminder of exploitation and humiliation buried under whitewashed history. As the civil rights movement rose in the 1960s, scholars returned to stories like that of the Conal with sharper eyes. They saw in it the intersection of race, gender, and power, a moment where the brutality of patriarchy and slavery collided in a single household. Feminist writers explored Eleanor's silence as a reflection of the restricted roles of women, even white women, under patriarchal systems. Black historians, meanwhile, focused on the enslaved men, reclaiming them not as nameless figures but as human beings caught in a horrific abuse of power. The scandal, once treated as gossip or horror, became a subject of analysis, evidence of the rot at the heart of the Old South. By the late 20th century, the story of the Conal's Pact entered popular culture in unexpected ways. Novels and plays borrowed elements of it, sometimes directly referencing the scandal, other times disguising it under fictional names. Southern Gothic literature in particular drew inspiration from the tale, with its themes of decay, corruption, and haunting. The Wetherell Plantation became a model for fictional cursed estates, its crumbling columns and ruined halls appearing again and again as symbols of a South unable to escape its sins. Even television documentaries exploring Haunted America picked up the legend. Paranormal investigators walked the grounds of the supposed Wetherell ruin, filming cold spots, flickering lights, and ghostly voices caught on tape. While historians debated the facts, popular audiences embraced the story as both a ghost tale and a historical scandal, proof that the sins of the past never truly die. The most fascinating part of the scandal's endurance is how it evolved depending on who told it. For some, it was a ghost story meant to entertain. For others, it was a morality tale about pride and destruction. For African American families, it was a reminder of cruelty and abuse, whispered across generations as proof of what their ancestors endured. For historians, it was both a mystery and a mirror, raising uncomfortable questions about how much of Southern history had been hidden under layers of silence. By the end of the century, one thing was clear. The Conal's dynasty had indeed been destroyed, not only in life but in memory. His story did not live on as one of honor, wealth, or power. Instead, it lived on as scandal, legend, and haunting. His name, once meant to inspire respect, became synonymous with disgrace. Eleanor, long silenced, was remembered as both victim and ghost. And the 7 enslaved men, though their true voices were lost to time, became central figures in a legend that refused to die. The story of the Wetherell Plantation did not vanish because it could not. It held too much power, too much meaning for too many people. It showed the depths of human cruelty and the fragility of power built on domination. It reminded America of a truth it often wished to forget, that slavery was not just labor in fields, but violence in every corner of life, even the most intimate. That legacy, like the ghostly whispers said to echo in the ruins, would not be silenced. By the turn of the 21st century, The story of the colonel who gave his wife to 7 enslaved men had transformed into something far larger than a scandal buried in a ruined plantation. It had become a legend, a dark parable passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped by generations, and given new meaning in every era. Whether told as ghost story, moral tale, or historical caution, its endurance revealed a truth about humanity's sins of power and cruelty cannot be buried, no matter how many years pass. They linger in memory, in whispers, in the haunted silence of the land itself. Historians, folklorists, and writers continue to argue about the story's factual accuracy. Was it truly an event that happened exactly as remembered, or had rumor and fear twisted fragments of truth into something unrecognizable? Some insisted that the scandal was exaggerated, a piece of gossip grown monstrous in the retelling. Others argued that, even if the details had been embellished, the core of the story rang true, because countless similar abuses had occurred across the South, hidden in the silences of enslaved lives. What mattered, they argued, was not whether every detail could be proven, but what the tale symbolized, and symbol it had become. The colonel represented pride, arrogance, and the destructive hunger for control. His wife, Eleanor, embodied both victimhood and complicity. The silent woman caught between obedience and despair, her name remembered only through others' voices. The 7 enslaved men, nameless in most retellings, symbolized both the vulnerability of bondage and the unbreakable truth that enslaved people bore the greatest burden of cruelty in a system designed to erase their humanity. The story's power lay in how it forced people to confront what slavery truly was, not just chains and fields, but humiliation, exploitation, and the crushing of dignity. In the modern era, writers reframed the scandal as a kind of Southern Gothic morality play. The ruined plantation became a symbol of the South itself, grand in appearance but rotting within, built on cruelty that eventually devoured its masters. The colonel's downfall served as a warning that empires built on domination will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own corruption. No wealth, no title, no dynasty could protect against the consequences of sin. For African American storytellers, the scandal resonated differently. It became a narrative of survival and truth-telling, proof that the horrors of slavery extended beyond what official histories dared to record. The haunting of the Wetherill estate, whether believed literally or figuratively, represented ancestral memory, the way pain reverberates through generations, refusing to be silenced. To them, the whispers in the halls were not ghostly illusions but echoes of lived trauma. By retelling the story, they honored the silenced voices of the enslaved, refusing to let those men remain faceless in the shadows of history. Meanwhile, ghost tours, documentaries, and popular culture twisted the tale into spectacle. Paranormal shows filmed episodes in abandoned Georgia plantations, claiming to capture the spirit of Eleanor weeping in her ruined chamber, or the shadows of enslaved men moving through the fields. Gothic novels borrowed freely from the Wetherill legend, filling their pages with cursed dynasties, forbidden desires, and haunted houses that mirrored the real scandal. To many outsiders, the story became entertainment. Yet even in this form, its core message refused to vanish. It still spoke of sin, ruin, and the long reach of history's consequences. In academic circles, the scandal became a lens for understanding power. Scholars of gender studied Eleanor as a figure trapped in patriarchy, a woman whose body was controlled as much as the enslaved men's were. Race scholars examined how the enslaved were doubly victimized, stripped of choice, then stripped of humanity again, in how the story remembered them only as shadows. Historians of the South used the tale as evidence of the moral corruption at the heart of slavery, a system that destroyed not only the enslaved but also the families who believed themselves its masters. And so, across all these retellings, the scandal became less about one family and more about an entire world. The ruined Wetherill estate symbolized the Old South itself, haunted not just by ghosts but by memory. Its crumbling columns were reminders of the fragility of dynasties built on human suffering. Its silence was filled with the cries of the voiceless. Its ruins stood as a warning: what is built on cruelty will not endure. Even today, the tale endures in whispers. Tourists still pause outside the ruins said to be the Wetherill Plantation, daring one another to enter. Writers still weave the scandal into fiction, each adding new shades of horror or tragedy. Historians still debate its truth, while folklorists remind us that legends, even if exaggerated, grow because they carry something that people recognize. and communities descended from the enslaved still carry the story as proof that history's darkest corners must be spoken, not buried. In the end, the Conal's name is not remembered for power, for honor, or for wealth. It is remembered for disgrace. His wife is not remembered for her beauty or her lineage, but for her silence and sorrow. The 7 enslaved men, though robbed of their names, are remembered as figures who expose the grotesque abuse of slavery in its most intimate form. Together, they form a legend that refuses to die, because it holds a truth too heavy to ignore. Power unchecked becomes destruction, and cruelty leaves legacies that echo through time. The Wetherell dynasty destroyed itself, but in doing so, it left behind something eternal. Not riches, not honor, not descendants to carry on its name, but a story. A story that became a curse, a warning, and a haunting all at once. A story that ensures the Conal's empire will never be forgotten, but never for the reasons he once desired. And so the final lesson of the scandal is clear. History cannot bury its sins. The soil remembers, the walls remember, the people remember. And when memory refuses to fade, it becomes legend. In legend, the Conal still paces his balcony, Eleanor still weeps in her chamber, and the shadows of 7 enslaved men still move across the fields. But beyond the ghostly images lies the truth that matters most. Cruelty destroys everything, even dynasties. And the echoes of that destruction will haunt the world forever.